Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the STEMx Policy Seminar. We're so glad that you're taking the time to join fellow STEM leaders from across the country to take a look and see at what's happening between the federal STEM initiatives, what's happening at the state level, and spend some time with each other this afternoon. My name is Heather Sherman, and I'm the director of the STEMx National Network, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. We're excited to hear from speakers representing Congress, federal agencies, and to learn about state STEM initiatives that are happening across the country. Next slide, please, Rob. Haha, thank you so much. Now I have to get synced up with you. So advancing high quality STEM education for all students across our great country is the goal of STEMx. We're a multi-state coalition of STEM leaders advocating for high-quality STEM education, amplifying effective practices, and building a professional community. Battelle is not new to STEM networks. STEMx is managed by Battelle, and we have two other state networks in our portfolio, the Tennessee STEM Innovation Network and the Ohio STEM Learning Network. Our colleagues from both of those networks are here today. We've been working to advance STEM education across the country since 2008. In 2010, we started STEMx, and we believe that through collaboration, we can ensure that all students can have access to high quality STEM education. Over the years, STEMx has changed, and we're in an era now where we have moved away from member access fees, and we're currently recruiting new members. For a long time, we did have access fees and had a fee-based structure. And last year, we shifted away from that approach because we recognized that we were taking people's money and giving it right back to them to attend meetings and events. So if you're a state STEM leader and you're not yet connected to STEMx, I'd like to use this opportunity to invite you to connect with me to see how we might be able to get you involved in our network. STEMx members meet monthly. We share strategies and priorities about things that are happening in each state. We have an annual meeting each year, which we haven't had an opportunity to have in the last few years. And we hope to have this policy summit next year in DC, and we hope to see you all there. One of the things our members tell us is that they value the fact that STEMx helps them keep connected to what's happening in DC. I'd like to thank the Battelle team who helped us get this event together today. In particular, I'd like to recognize and thank my co-host, Thomas Phillips, who will be leading parts of the session. I'd also like to say thanks to Regina Schofield for her support and collaboration, and Rob Evans, who is managing the tech and managing all of the communications. None of us works in isolation, and today, those of us on this team and all of us who are part of national STEM work are going to spend some time thinking about the ways in which we're connected to one another, from the federal level down to the state level. We're going to start with a congressional update. Then we're going to hear from different federal agencies. We'll hear from our friend Klaus von Zastro, who's going to tell us and give us a look about what's happening across the country in STEM education. And then we'll hear from individual states and the ways in which they're leveraging federal dollars to advance STEM in their particular states. Before we do any of that, though, we are lucky to have a welcome from Representative Frank Lucas from Oklahoma. He sent along a video to be able to welcome all of you to this event today.
Hello, I'm Frank Lucas, Ranking Member of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss STEM education today. This issue has been one of my top priorities since my first day as a ranking member of the Science Committee. Improving STEM education across the country, from the busy streets of DC to the rural plains of Oklahoma, has strong bipartisan support, as it should. Conversations like the one you're hosting today will help spur progress to achieve that goal. The global economy is changing. We're seeing incredible demand for STEM skills, and careers in science are growing faster than any other sector. But employers are struggling to fill jobs. Preparing students to step into these roles will create higher paying jobs, boost local economies, and relieve labor squeezes for businesses. Having a robust STEM workforce is also essential to global leadership. I've said it once, I'll say it again. Whoever leads in science and technology will set the rules of the road for decades to come. In other words, our economy, national security, and way of life are on the line. I cannot overstate the role a strong STEM pipeline has in maintaining our advantage in the world stage. But American students are still underperforming compared with other countries. One reason for that is the fact that many students, especially those in rural and underserved areas, don't have access to high-quality STEM learning opportunities. These students can face all sorts of barriers to achieving STEM education, including a shortage of science and math teachers, a high rate of teacher turnover, and a lack of access to STEM resources. For instance, many students don't have internet access at home. Of the 21 million Americans who lack access to broadband, the majority live in rural areas. In the Science Committee, we've introduced a number of bipartisan bills over the years to address these issues. I am especially proud of the Rural STEM Education Research Act, which supports research on rural STEM education, gives teachers more resources and training in STEM, and engages students in hands-on education within their communities. Critically, it also addresses connectivity disparities in rural classrooms by increasing access to broadband. I would like to thank STEMx and you all for working with me as I developed this legislation. And now, for your support in moving it through Congress and getting it signed into law. In this committee, we're also working on improving STEM opportunities in higher education, giving minority-serving institutions and historic black colleges and universities better resources to expand STEM research and learning. With comprehensive strategies like this and a focus on bipartisanship, we can open the door to good-paying jobs for more students, strengthen the STEM workforce pipeline, and maintain our global leadership in science. Again, thank you for working with my staff, like Kate Johnson, whom you'll hear from shortly, on these important issues, and for your support of this committee's efforts in improving America's STEM pipeline. I was pleased I could kick off today's discussion. There is so much progress to be made, and I'm excited to see what we can achieve when we put our heads together.
Thank you so much for Oklahoma's support in getting our event started. Next, I'm going to kick it off to Thomas Phillips, who is going to lead part one of our policy seminar today. And I will leave you to it, Thomas.
Heather, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to have everyone on the call today. I'm especially excited to introduce two congressional staffers who I've had the pleasure of working with on a number of STEM policy issues. First, I'll introduce Kate Johnson, who's been with the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee for the last 4 years, and a senior professional staff member there for close to a year and a half. Before that, she was Assistant Director of Federal Relations for the University of Wisconsin, and before that worked in a member office on the House side for about 6 years. During her time with the University of Wisconsin, we had the chance to work together on a host of issues, particularly policies related to federal research and development. That was through the Energy Sciences Coalition. More recently, I've had the pleasure of working with Kate on the Research and Technology Subcommittee's STEM portfolio, particularly around rural STEM education. I'll let her share some exciting news on that front shortly. And before I turn the floor over to Kate, I want to briefly introduce Taylor Ware, who's been with Senator Warnock of Georgia's office for the better part of a year. He's a freshman senator serving the last 2 years of a 6-year term that Senator Isaacson retired at the end of 2019. And even though he's been in office for just under a year, Senator Warnock has already championed a number of STEM priorities. We're talking about Taylor, though. Before joining his staff, she spent 3 years on the House side of the Hill, rising through the ranks from an intern to a fellow supporting the Congressional Black Caucus, then as the Director of Education Policy for the Joint Congressional Staff Task Force on Racial Justice and Reform. I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with Taylor through both the STEM Education Coalition and the Task Force on American Innovation, and I'm excited that she's with us today. But Kate, I'll give you the floor to talk about your work with the Science Committee.
Thank you, Thomas. Good afternoon. It's really nice to see you all. Thank you for the nice introduction, Thomas. You just took up 3 minutes of my talking points. No, I'm just kidding. But it's really nice to meet you all. As Mr. Lucas said in the opening statement, the Science Committee has been working on STEM education for quite a while and actively. We have a number of bills that we had passed the House so far this year, ranging from programs focused on identifying and addressing barriers to underrepresented groups of entering the STEM pipeline, to creating capacity and partnerships with minority serving institutions, to my personal a bill that's very personal to me and important, the Rural STEM Education and Research Act, which was led by Mr. Lucas. We are very lucky on this committee that we tend to work in a very bipartisan manner, especially when it comes to STEM education. The Science Committee has jurisdiction over the STEM programs at the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NASA, NOAA, and then the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. So we have a pretty broad bandwidth of policy areas as it relates to STEM education. One big bill that we have been working on that passed the House is the National Science Foundation for the Future Act. This is a large reauthorization. It's a five-year reauthorization, which doubles the funding for basic research, actually more than doubles the funding of the program of the agency over 5 years. This includes, as you're probably well aware, the National Science Foundation is one of the largest funders of STEM education, and this includes a massive further investment in their education, research, and STEM development activities. So I just thought maybe I would touch on a few of those provisions that I think are particularly of interest to STEMx. One is we have a program focused on scaling up innovations in pre-K through 12 STEM education. I think one of the big challenges over the 4 years that I've been working on this portfolio is NSF tends to fund a lot of successful one-off programs, but doesn't necessarily, in their opinion, they are not responsible for translating that into programs that then can be more widely adopted and utilized across the country by different schools. And so we are establishing 3 centers for transformative education research. And the goal of that is to create regional centers, much like STEMx, to bring together local leaders to share best practices and implementation of innovative STEM curriculum, to kind of take some of these research projects that are being funded by NSF one-off that have been proven to be successful and find ways to scale those up at different individual institutions and schools across the country. And so I'm really excited about that. We have tried to do some work to coordinate NSF better with the Department of Education through a number of years ago. We created the Co-STEM committee, advising committee, which is part of OSTP, and it is an interagency advising committee in which all of the agencies that work on STEM programming come together to coordinate their activities. It hasn't accomplished that goal yet, and so I think I'm really interested to hear from you all today if you have thoughts on further ways in which we can take some of the research and programming that NSF is supporting and scale that up and get it out into communities to be utilized. I'll also just flag for you in that bill, we also double the Robert Noyce Teacher Scholarship Program at NSF, which is a program in which NSF sponsors teachers to go to universities to do some hands-on research. We're really proud of that. And the last thing that I'll just mention quickly is we established a new technology directorate in that program, which is focused on translating basic research into further applications and upscaling technology. This is a big priority for Congress to do this tech directorate to try to increase our competitiveness, but we also realize that a key component of that is a great STEM workforce. And so I'm looking forward to examining opportunities for us to build up through that new directorate, ways to partner STEM training and opportunities with industry needs, and how do we strengthen that relationship. I'll just quickly also highlight, and I should mention, Thomas said that we had some exciting news. So our NSF for the Future Act is part of a larger package of House bills, and the Senate has a large competitiveness bill called the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, USICA. And it was just announced yesterday by Majority Leader Schumer and Speaker Pelosi that they are officially going to be doing a conferencing of the House and the Senate to try to negotiate these bills and get this package done and across the finish line, which would mean some great investments in both basic research, US competitiveness, and of course, STEM education. And part of that, another bill that's part of that package in the House side is the DOE Office of Science for the Future Act. You all may be familiar with the Workforce Development and Teachers and Scientists program that the Office of Science does. This bill will make some investments to bolster that program and increase its engagement with the numbers of teachers that it involves. And my understanding is, I will be honest, I'm not an expert on the program, but my understanding is that program offers opportunities for teachers to come to national labs and kind of get that hands-on research. Then lastly, I just want to quickly mention the Rural STEM Education Act. I am so grateful for working with STEMx as we developed this. This was a bill that started as an idea from Mr. Lucas, and we built it from the ground up by holding roundtables and working with the community and getting feedback. This program has a large section focused specifically on teacher training, developing resources for teachers that are working in rural schools. So that includes resources to allow teachers to have remote training programs, also developing curriculum and tools that teachers can use that are teaching a subject matter, but for different grade levels, because I know that is quite common in rural communities. And it also creates a national cohort or network, which is based on both the Tennessee STEM Network and the Ohio STEM Network, to be supported by the NSF to create a network in which teachers are able to share their best practices, training, and so forth, to create this network and increase resources and support system for these teachers. It also has a big focus on in-place learning for students. I think often students, when they think of chemistry or physics, they get overwhelmed and don't totally understand how it relates to their real life. So bringing, connecting those types of activities to things in their communities, I think really brings it home and creates that connection that then lights their spark and wants them to stay in the pipeline. And so the program, we have language in there supporting that kind of work for students. Another thing that it has is focusing on with existing networks in rural communities, such as partnering with 4-H, FFA, and extension programs in rural communities, given they have network and close working relationships with folks already established. And so that's part of our goal in that is to capitalize on the existing networks and utilize that to get STEM resources and get students interested and engaged in STEM. One great example that I have from Oklahoma is we have this program that works with the Oklahoma FFA, which it's called Blue Coat to White Coat program. And it's a training program for students in FFA who get the Navy corduroy coats. And they get a scholarship to do extracurricular training and research programs. And then when they go to a state college, if their GPA stays above a certain level, they have a guaranteed seat to get into medical school in Oklahoma. And it's been a really successful program in getting students engaged and interested in furthering their careers in that way, in an area that quite often is overlooked, those students, when it comes to STEM. I think I covered my full time. If I'm looking forward to questions and answers, there's a lot more I can talk about, but I will stop now.
Hey, thank you so much for the deep dive into the work that you and the committee have been doing on STEM and what's coming up. Very, very grateful to have you on the call, and really excited to hear that, you know, as part of this conversation, you're looking for the feedback from our group. I know we're eager to give it, particularly in ways that programs that might have been one-off can grow, become more sustainable, and can become scaled. Looking forward to that next part of this conversation. But before we get there, I want to turn it over to Taylor to talk about her work in Senator Warnock's office, and give us that perspective. Taylor, over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. Can you all hear me? Perfect. Thank you again so much to STEMx for having me here to represent Senator Warnock's team. I kind of want to talk about my time before coming to Congress to give a little bit of background on my relationship with STEM education. So I worked with youth workforce development programming in my hometown of Prince George's County, Maryland. And we had a program through which the youth could work directly with the county's Office of Information Technology. And through competition, the youth ages 14 to about 20 were able to create solutions to some of the county's most pressing problems. So that including literacy, food insecurity, you name it. The children were so enamored just with having a full 6-week summer program to solve some of the problems facing their community. And so in seeing that, and in seeing how many youth were then propelled into higher education or into pursuing STEM in high school, I think it really made me want to be more vested in STEM education. And so I'm so excited to have the opportunity to speak on this panel. It's really a full circle moment for me. As Katie kind of mentioned, my boss has been really supporting a lot of these efforts on the Senate side, including the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. The main provisions, while we are obviously supportive of the entire bill, our core work, I would say, is definitely making STEM education more accessible and having more equity at its center. And within that, making sure that communities do have access to broadband and that it is affordable, because we know that it remains a barrier, particularly in parts of Georgia, for students who are looking to pursue these research pathways and these high-need research fields and might not be familiar with the technological needs that they need to really branch into these industries and to be leaders in these spaces. In addition, we have been very supportive of the Directorate of Technology within NSF, and then also capacity building grants for our MSIs and HBCUs to ensure that these folks have a seat at the table and to make sure that their students are present in these spaces. D&I is something that is very important to STEM because within having diverse fields, you're able to have diverse research. You're able to have research that speaks more to the breadth of problems that communities are facing. And my boss is very keen on that as an HBCU graduate and as somebody who recognizes the various resources that different students have to offer. And so we were extremely fortunate to work on provisions in U.S. Innovation and Competition Act that would empower our HBCUs and our MSIs to provide improved research infrastructure. So be that laboratories at the schools, be that electronic equipment for students. I think one thing that the pandemic has taught us all is that not every student has access to their own computer. And so providing students with those types of resources on their college campuses is critical. In addition to that, my boss is also working diligently on finding ways to bridge the gaps within rural Georgia to ensure that no student is left out of the conversation within STEM education. And so be that working to co-sponsor the Rural Education Act, and making sure that these students, again, have a voice at the table and that their teachers also have a voice at the table. I think that there are so many educators, and my science colleague who works directly with the committee can speak more to this, but I think so many educators want to help to be the solution and just need the investment so that they can be that voice in the classroom for their students, so that they can bring the materials into the classroom. And so for me, my work specifically is more so with the Department of Education as the education and labor staffer, but I do think that there has to be a continuum between the different facets of STEM, be that science or education, to ensure that students are getting the support that they need. And then the last kind of thing that I'll speak to, being somebody who has background in workforce development, is making sure that Georgia remains a leader in the STEM workforce. And part of that is also investing in our workforce development programs. So the senator is a proud member of the Career and Technical Education Caucus that really promotes and advocates for career and technical education programs at community colleges, which also those programs do a great job with dual enrollment. And we know that dual enrollment is an incredible tool for giving folks affordable access to college, in that it gives students high school credits or college credits while they're still in high school. And so by the time that they get to college, they already have some of those credits and it reduces their cost on the back end. In addition to that, we're very supportive of the Telecommunication and Workforce Training Grant Program, again, to provide resources for the workforce. I know that we are still working to recover economically, and a part of that is certainly making sure that our workforce has the tools that they need to re-enter the workforce when they're ready, or to skill up to advance in their careers once they're ready. And so that is certainly something that we've heard from our constituents is important. We've heard it from our colleges that it's important. And we know that it is challenging, especially in smaller or rural towns, to maintain your talent when there are so many different employers who are offering high pay for these high need positions. And so we are constantly working with stakeholders on the ground to hear out, what kinds of skill work do you all need? What kind of credentials do these folks need? And then what types of programs can we help to support and uplift so that they, like Katie said, are not one-off programs, but that they can scale up and ultimately serve more of our communities. And I think the last thing I'll speak to is within the various infrastructure packages that are coming out, be that the bipartisan infrastructure package or Build Back Better. We are certainly still monitoring the different provisions that will reinforce the things that I talked about before. So the funding for HBCU and MSI research infrastructure, because currently there are no high research HBCUs. And there are very few MSIs, and those student populations absolutely deserve the opportunity to engage in these spaces. And then also the teacher preparation programs. I think that those are critical if we're going to have long-term solutions to making sure that there are teachers to fulfill these high need fields. It can't just be on teachers to teach the skills. They absolutely need the preparation to stay on top of trends, to engage in industry. And so we're very happy to hear feedback from you all on where the gaps are, to hear from you all as to what programs we could better support and uplift. And that's kind of where I'll stop on the legislative front, but I will also uplift that the senator's team is always happy to talk through different grant opportunities that folks are also eligible for. That is a service that is available to all of our constituents. So if there's ever a program that you feel could be eligible for a grant or federal funding, and you're just confused as to what that grant funding could look like, that's absolutely something that your representatives and senators can do. And so we're constantly looking for opportunities to do that as well on the constituent services side. With that, I think I have gone through the gamut of most of my experience with STEM education. Again, very excited to be here and excited to hear your questions.
Taylor, thank you very much. Really appreciate the broad overview of your boss's priorities, your commitment and your work. And now I'm going to ask some questions both for you and for Kate. I want to let our members know that we're going to be opening the floor up to your questions here soon. While I'm asking my sort of introductory questions, feel free to put yours in the chat. I can then call on folks to come off mute and ask those questions, but we'll start getting them queued on here in the chat right now. But to kick off, I've got one for Kate that I'll modify for Taylor once Kate answers. But Kate, since you have experience working directly for a member, but also as professional staff on a committee, I'm just, I feel like folks on this call might be interested in that dichotomy, that difference, and how your engagement with groups like STEMx and our networks looks different from each of those roles.
Thank you. Taylor could probably speak to this too, at least from the personal office perspective, but quite often who we're meeting with in a personal office are constituents, people from, I worked in the House office, so it was people from my member's district. And I tell every group when I talk to them about advocacy, because I did it for a living before I came back to the Hill, the best thing you can do is tell a member a really good story. And if they like it, every time they talk about STEM education, they're going to retell that story that you told them. So like if it hits home and it connects to stuff, they will repeat it over and over again, and it can be really impactful. Quite often we have, as my job on the committee, quite often personal offices will have constituents come in and talk about a really successful program. And if it sparks a member's interest, a member will come to me and be like, hey, I heard about this really great program. Is there anything that we can do in your big reauthorization bill or a standalone bill to either expand this program at a federal level or beef it up, or what can we do to support it? And so then I work with that office to try to develop something that can be of assistance or direct them to programs that already exist that could be utilized to support that program, kind of going to Taylor's point of grants that might be available. And so, but on the committee staff, I quite often am working on creating legislation from scratch. And so getting to connect with you all in STEMx, the STEM Ed Coalition, just having outreach and engagement with you all on a regular basis, on ideas and areas that you think are forward looking and the next areas that we should be concentrating on is so helpful. Rural STEM, Mr. Lucas was the agriculture committee chairman before coming to the science committee. And he is an OSU, Oklahoma State University alum. So he loves his land grants and extension. And he was in FFA, so he has his FFA jacket, if you couldn't see it in the background of his video hanging up. And I got hired and he said, Kate, I want to do something to help my constituents in STEM education. And so we did a roundtable with a couple of teachers from Oklahoma talking about their experience in trying to teach STEM and their challenges. We had someone from Google. Google had just opened up a computer science program. And then we had two researchers that focus on researching the challenges of rural schools and STEM education. And that is how we started developing. And then we shared the text with STEM Ed Coalition and other stakeholders. And your input on that bill was invaluable and improved the bill substantially. And I'm so grateful for it. So that's kind of the process that I do. But just really engagement, my door is always open. Thomas can share my email. the more I hear, the more I learn, the more we can think about things. So, but I'll let.
Kate, thanks so much. And I think that Taylor can definitely speak to the personal office side. And I even heard her talk about, a service that the office provides in terms of engagement with maybe the Georgia State Network or groups that look like it in terms of helping find grant opportunities. Taylor, what would you say engagement with a network like STEMx looks like from your perspective?
Sure. Really appreciate that question. So as a staffer who's kind of coming into the STEM education world more fully, I think it's really been awesome to have organizations like the STEM Coalition to lean on and to ask for that deep institutional knowledge of the issue. I think it can be very tempting to take and run with a bill idea or an issue without the context. And so it's really important, I think, to engage with stakeholders as frequently as possible to verify, what's the history of this issue? What's the context of this issue? So for me, it's statewide. So what is the issue's imprint or impact in Georgia? And then also figuring out if there are already policies working on the state level. And so we love to engage with our constituents. I think that is the best part of my job, but it's also among the more critical components of my job. I'll also say that we do a lot of work with our state team who are based in Georgia. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. office, but our Georgia team does a really great job with convening the different stakeholders so that they can actually meet and take a look at these solutions from different perspectives. So recently we put together a roundtable conversation with our defense stakeholders, some of our STEM stakeholders, and then our higher education folks. And so we're acting as that convening body, but it's also allowing us to hear the different opinions on the bills themselves and how we can continue to move these issues forward. So again, constituent engagement is something that I want folks to feel comfortable doing. It's why we're here. We want to engage with you. We need to engage with you. And I absolutely agree with Kate as well. The storytelling makes a world of impact. In my role, I also work with the senator's correspondence from constituents. And so thousands of messages. It's very eye-opening and refreshing when we see a constituent story speak to a different program that has been impactful for their kids or for their community, or when they're telling us that, a system isn't serving them the way that it should. That signals to me that I should be talking with my boss about that and how we can either solve that legislatively or through a partnership with another constituent organization. So all of those things really comprise the base of my work.
Taylor, thank you very much. I've seen a couple questions come into chat, and I'm going to start with some of these, and if no more come in, I've got some others that we can supplement, but these are two really great questions. One, and I should mention, as part of STEMx, we're joined by a number of different types of members. We have our state networks that, and some are public-private partnerships that are housed out of the State Department of Education. Others are housed out of universities. We also have, because Battelle manages a number of DOE national laboratories, we invited our lab education leads to be part of the STEMx network because of the work that they do in their states and communities. And we've got a couple questions here that came from some of our folks at the labs. One is from Ken White, who heads up the STEM education programs at Brookhaven National Lab. And he says, as an education leader, and Ken, if you want to get on and ask, by all means, I'll turn it over to you. You can ask better than me just reading it.
Sure, it's just in there, but I have to say I'm very excited to hear that we may have the opportunity to bring teachers back into the laboratories on a funded basis. We're running several programs where teachers have become leaders from a prior program that was supported through funding, and that program ended in 2009. Probably 60% of those teachers are still engaged with us at the laboratory and bringing their students in different ways, including things as sophisticated as using the newest light source in the system, the National Synchrotron Light Source 2, to do authentic research. And so bringing teachers back in, I think, makes a huge impact. And so I just wanted to see if we could hear a little more about the thought process behind authorizing that and what the expectations are. Thank you for offering to do this.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Kenneth. So I'll be honest, I weighed in on this language at the end, just for the terminology and word choice that they used, but I can talk about it at a high level and then send you some more details if you'd like after. So the goal of the program, I think, is to reinstate and encourage the program that ended in 2009 to begin officially again and have an authorized program. Part of it too is focusing on a larger engagement with HBCUs, MSIs, and other underserved groups. There's an emphasis in the language to increase partnerships, to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion within the training workforce. So both undergraduate and graduate. And then there's a investment and authorization number, which unfortunately I don't know off the top of my head, for the teacher training program at the labs. And I think that's a big priority for us. When we had our roundtable, and I know I keep going back to rural STEM, but this is beyond just rural communities. One of the teachers that participated had gotten a NOIS scholarship and had gone to OSU for a summer program to actually get to do in-lab research and training. And she said that experience like sparked her engagement, because in her training, she wasn't actually trained to be a STEM teacher. They just had no one there and she volunteered to do it. So she had never done research. And so getting to actually do that experience and then be able to bring that back to the classroom and translate it, she said has made a huge impact in improving her hands-on opportunities. And so I think we were really excited to support an increased investment in that at DOE and partnering with the labs, especially because a number of the labs are in areas that aren't traditionally, largely supporting STEM programs. And so like Idaho National Lab, Oak Ridge. So getting to reach those communities through those labs, I think we want to be as supportive as possible.
Yeah, thank you. And what's been interesting for us is the practice of using virtual over the last couple of years has really expanded our reach too. And so, for example, at Brookhaven, we did a program with the Florida, Georgia, Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation team. So we're connected in with the National Science Foundation programs, and that was with high school students. So most of them are hosting high school students and high school teachers, and being able to interface through those collaborations has been important too, to reach out to areas that we may not have had access to in the past. So we're excited about it. Thank you.
Ken, thanks so much. And Kate, thanks for your answer there. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, who asked a great question about reaching underserved communities. If you want to go ahead, Kathy.
Thanks, Thomas. Appreciate it. So Kathy Keith, I'm with Los Alamos National Laboratory. We are in a rural, remote, and very diverse area in northern New Mexico, and working every day in school systems and with children. And what we see is an achievement gap that is big, and after COVID, getting bigger. And, I think one of the things that concerns me the most is looking forward. I see young people not testing proficient in math by the time they're freshmen in high school, and not leaving high school proficient in math, and realizing that they're being systematically locked out of any future careers in STEM because of that. So I would love to learn a little bit from you guys about what you're thinking in terms of policy initiatives that may help us solve this really real problem.
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in. I think this is where traditional education policy plays a big role along with STEM policy. there are certainly some interventions that I think are going to be needed to refortify students' interaction with these fields. I think particularly when you've had a year where students are learning from home and with different parental dynamics or learning in different environments, it's really difficult to say how much exposure they're getting to practicing the work. I know that in Georgia, we've encouraged a lot of our school district partners to really start talking to the state about, investing or when they would want to invest in robust tutoring programs. And those are things where high schoolers who maybe already have that STEM exposure can help the elementary school children. I'll also shout out the community schools program, which is essentially a grant through which different school districts can place volunteers in schools. They can bring different programming to schools. But I think things like that are in the toolbox to really help school districts bring in folks who are invested in these communities, who are already working in the industries in these communities. But I think that it shows students, this is attainable, and it gives them somebody to work with so that they're not feeling like they're alone in this work, that they're not feeling like, oh, if my parent's not great at math or great at science, then I can't succeed in it. I mean, my mom was an engineer and I'm still not the math protege of the family, but I always had her support and homework help, always had her resources. And so for students who might not grow up in that type of environment, I think it's really important that school districts kind of look for creative opportunities to bridge the gap and to create partnerships to help those students along.
Taylor, thanks so much. Really appreciate that. Kate, I don't know if you have anything to add on that front.
I think Taylor covered it. I think this challenge goes back to the challenge I mentioned before of NSF could fund one really great program at a school that increases math, but then being able to scale up and utilize that curriculum at another school is a challenge we still haven't been able to conquer. And so, but I think also to Taylor's point, mentoring and bringing people into the classroom to demonstrate that you do use these tools in the future is really key. And I have a real concern about us not having a STEM literate workforce, because as AI becomes reality, as quantum, as autonomous trucking, I mean, there's so many examples in which just basic STEM skills will be essential in everyday life. And so I think it's a concern and it's a humongous challenge. And I don't have an answer, unfortunately, but I hope that we can work together to try to find some solutions, or at least attempt to make some solutions. So.
Oh, I do want to add one more thing. I'm sorry, Thomas.
Not
To the work within, I think, the HBCUs and MSI spaces, I think that's going to have some really positive impacts, and that it's going to send a lot of students back into these underserved communities to start that work either as teachers or as industry leaders. So I think, filling the pipeline on both ends is really going to be helpful in ultimately getting us to a place where in the K-12 space, students are feeling supported, but there's also folks in these workforces that can go back into their communities.
Thank you both. I know we're scheduled for a break at 2:50, but there's one more question in the chat, and I think it's a really good one from Lee Meadows. Lee, if you want to introduce yourself and go to that question, I think we can wrap up this panel with that one. I think it's a good one to close on. Also, thanks to Mike for putting a great resource in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm with the Alabama STEM Council. I've been at this work of STEM education and teacher education for a long time. One of the things that I see in schools in Alabama, and I think it's true around the nation, is teachers are caught in so many competing priorities. STEM education is one of them, but most classroom teachers will say, before the pandemic, they will say, I'm just exhausted by all the things pulling on me, and I can't really get to actually teaching. And then, of course, the pandemic and social justice issues has made that all the more complicated. Many of you know the history well enough to know that Sputnik was a huge change for us in STEM education, and it created this national priority. I think that the Nation at Risk report from the Reagan administration did the same thing with the whole standards movement. But I heard, man, I respect a whole lot, Michael Martyr with the UTeach Network say a few years ago that we haven't had a national driving force or a national priority around STEM education in probably 20 years. And when he said that, I said that I thought that makes a lot of sense to me. So that's my question, and our panelists may not be able to answer that because it's a really high level question. Maybe they can give us some hope of something that's coming, but I feel like we need some kind of national priority around STEM and STEM education that gets at all the things we've talked about: underserved kids, preparing them for STEM workforce, but a way to cut through and really bring STEM up to the top as a priority in our schools. Now, I'm a nerd. I love science. I love STEM. It works really well for me. But I'm also thinking about all the kids who are able right now in American schools to opt out of STEM education. They're able as children, as teenagers, to say, I'm not a very good math person, and they opt out. And when they opt out, then they've closed the door to great jobs. And in my state, we're having kids close the door to the only STEM workforce that we're going to get, and that's when we grow our own. So I'll stop there. Just, is there any sense that anyone has of a way to create, is something coming that's going to create this national priority and sense of urgency around STEM? And I know it's a huge question.
I'll go first, unless Taylor, you want to go first.
You got it.
Okay, so I think, of course, I live in a bubble of all this stuff, but I do think that the urgency has become a reality. This large package we were just talking about, the U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness Act, is the largest investment in R&D and STEM in 10 plus years, probably longer than that, maybe 20. It is going to be like basically a quadrupling of investments, and that includes STEM education and training. I think this emphasis on the threat of competitiveness and these future technologies is getting people to realize STEM is essential and not just a secondary choice. And I think there is a sense of urgency now on the Hill. One thing that is creating a sense of urgency, we are looking at the semiconductor industry, and we're about to pass this huge bill that's going to make these investments to build these foundries that are supposed to bring 140,000 jobs to the United States. All of those jobs are STEM jobs. Are we going to have the capacity to fill those jobs? Not right now. So like, we need to start making investments and looking at these areas and prioritizing them. And so I think there's starting to be a connection of that and that urgency again. Test scores it's frustrating. I do think, one of the challenges is, and Taylor can speak to this more than I can, the challenge of we can do things at the federal level, but these decisions for requirement and stuff are done at the local level. And so all we can do is make investments at this level, but to push, like say I can't believe that computer science isn't utilized more across the board. I have a friend who's a teacher here in DC at a charter school, and they had to make the choice after being remote for a year to either cut STEM or reduce reading. And they cut STEM, and that was like devastating to me. And she said that was a reality. We didn't have the teacher anymore, and our students are so behind on reading, and they need to pass the tests. So and tests serve a purpose. I'm not saying they don't, but it's a real challenge and balancing act. And so I would just emphasize needing to communicate those needs at the state level of these investments is really important. But also I think the emphasis and the urgency is a reality on the Hill right now, at least with regards to the threat of competitiveness, but I'll let Taylor jump in.
Thanks, Kate. No, I absolutely would echo that. I think the conversation around competitiveness and just how America is advancing these various tech policy jobs that are also going to have manufacturing components and research components. It's absolutely reinvigorating that conversation at the national level. I think even if it's being quietly done, I think part of it is also, creating partnerships where we're doing things like this. We're convening with folks who are on the ground that can echo these calls that, at the national level, the conversations are being had. And so we should be echoing these conversations at the state and local level. I know in working with school districts, the issue is absolutely, it can be a budget matter, it can be a teacher workforce matter. And so I think what I've consistently heard is that it's not a one and done issue. It's definitely, we invest in the teacher prep so that teachers want to stay and are prepared to stay longer, and that they're prepared to teach in the fields that they are entering into. It's also, investing in the broadband so that the students have the tools to stay on top of their work. And then in addition to all of that, it's also making sure that school districts understand from the industry folks in the area, that there is demand for this. I'll go back to, the youth workforce development program that I was part of. And I think a big pull for that Office of Information Technology program was that the industry leaders in the area went to the county executive and told him, we're going to be lacking these jobs in the area, and we won't be able to compete with these larger cities, and we won't be able to have the talent that are going to bring wages back home. And so, again, echoing that urgency at the state and local level and getting on the same page, I think is really crucial, but I think it's already starting. I think it's really just continuing to reiterate and harp on and to make different touches within our communities to see how far that can go. And then the last thing I'll say is, and this is coming from the daughter of a teacher, I think that I think we need to create a support for teachers who might want to go into STEM education, but just don't know how to make that pivot. So if you've been teaching, English or whatever for most of your career, but you want to transition into computer sciences, that should be something that teachers are empowered to do, but often they might not have the resources through their district. And so I think creating investments where teachers can get that training later in their careers is really going to be pivotal in making sure that the urgency is meeting opportunity so that we're not, having folks just kind of hanging by a thread. But I do absolutely think that the urgency is at the national level. I think it's just, it's time to really continue to create that messaging across the board.
Thomas, can I jump in on one more thing? I was just reading the chat. I know that we're over time or just about, but just real quick, someone put in the Competes Act puts STEM education as a national priority. OSTP does do their 5-year STEM strategic plan, which is part of the Competes Act. But in USICA and in this big competitiveness package we're about to be conferencing on, one thing that we're looking at is creating a national S&T strategy. So it's like the national defense strategy and the national security strategy, in which all of the federal government coordinates and has priority areas within S&T, and workforce and STEM is one of those priorities that would be part of that national strategy. So we are working on that. That's a provision that Mr. Waltz has led from Florida on our behalf. And then it was just introduced in the Senate on a bipartisan basis, and I can't remember who led it, but we're really hoping that that gets to be part of this package that we negotiate. So,
Kate and Taylor, thank you both so much for your time. Don't apologize for going over your participation. Your great answers are why I asked both of you to be with us this afternoon. I really want to thank you on behalf of STEMx and all of our networks for your time today. And I'll be sure to, if it's okay with both of you, share your information with our folks just in case they have any follow-up questions. In the meantime, we will break for 5 minutes. Please be back at 3:05 for the start of our next panel. But really appreciate that first panel and the great discussion, robust discussion that it started. Appreciate everyone's time so far. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I'll just give it a second for folks to return, make sure that we're all back here. If you can hear my voice, come back with your hot coffee, hopefully. Although it's a little late in the day for that, unless you're on the West Coast. For our second conversation, we are joined by two powerhouses of the STEM policy world. Nafisa Owens, Assistant Director of STEM Education at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, on detail from NSF. And Patty Curtis, who many of you know, and is the Robert Noyce Ellen Letman STEM Education Fellow at the U.S. Department of Education. Before taking her detail at OSTP, Nafisa served at NSF over 8 years, most recently as a Senior Advisor for Policy in the Education and Human Resources Directorate. Prior to joining NSF, she was an Associate at Quality Education for Minorities Network. She also served as Director of the California State Summer School for Mathematics and Science at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she oversaw summer programs for middle and high school students. Great hands-on experience. But before joining the Department of Education, Patty Curtis served as the Director of the DC office for the Museum of Science and the National Center for Technology Literacy, where she focused on advancing formal and out-of-school pre-K to 12th grade engineering education across the nation by advocating for federal and state policies and programs. She also served on the U.S. House STEM Education Caucus Steering Committee and the Title IV Part A Coalition Steering Committee. Previously, she was a government relations representative for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and served as a leader of the STEM Education Coalition. Please help me welcome both Nafisa and Patty. These women have an incredible wealth of experience and knowledge to share with us today. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Nafisa to kick off this conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. So again, a pleasure to be here today. I am glad and happy to express some of the things that OSTP has been working on for the past few months, particularly with a change of administration. We have new leadership at OSTP under Eric Lander, our OSTP director, and in particular, Alondra Nelson, who is the Deputy Director for Science and Society, who has that's a very new division within OSTP, particularly drawing attention to the connection of our work for science and technology to the communities that we serve. Earlier today, we heard about some of the challenges that we know exist. And I think it's really important just to start off to point out that many of the challenges that we see existing within science and technology is very much a reflection of the inequities that exist in our structural systems. And really, we want to find and identify ways to break down those barriers to ensure that science and technology is accessible as possible to all those who have an interest. And so the thing that I think is really important that I can share with you today is one of the ways that we have taken a new pair of eyes to who is engaged in STEM, how that engagement can be increased, amplified, explored, and really thinking about the ways that we not only encourage that formal STEM participation, but really the informal too, as much as we can, that sense of belonging. There are so many areas within STEM where that belonging differs. If you're looking at different areas of science, technology within academia, how that varies within various science fields, particularly if that representation is not kind of norm across the board or where there is a lack of parity, but also thinking about, in particular, how belonging affects different marginalized groups, whether you're looking at racial or ethnic, whether you're looking at, gender or other underserved communities. So how their sense of belonging within STEM is disconnected to that to the ecosystem. But then also even thinking about just the varying layers that we have within those communities. So if you look at persons with disabilities, the experiences perhaps how they differ from those who may have invisible disabilities, with mental health or a neurodiversity. And then also, I think one thing that is also part of how we're looking at this work is where those identities do overlap and how the intersectionality of STEM and of communities kind of has an interplay to the work. So, from the very beginning, we've had the support of the president who has very clearly articulated this focus on the importance of equity. And that was also conveyed to Eric Lander in the letter that the president gave to him even before he was confirmed. It was made to the OSTP director. And the question at hand is how can we truly engage and guarantee those who are our American public can be fully engaged in this work. And so Eric wanted to really engage in conversations with those who could provide thought and knowledge to this work. Some of the reasons why. One, because these insights will fuel and are critical to establishing our science and technology insights for the future, because we do want to be globally competitive. And so engaging all Americans in these conversations are really important in advancing that. But then also, again, equity, this is the very right thing to do to ensure we all have a voice and can all be engaged in it as we see, fit. And to the points being made earlier about having a STEM literate, population. So again, we really want to engage folks in this conversation. And so a effort was made, the time is now, advancing equity in science and technology was launched, and it's kind of been a two-phase effort. So the first phase of it has been engaging in roundtable discussions. There are 5 roundtables that have been held so far. These have been on a variety of focused themes and topics. One being around disability, and that was held during Disability Month. And so very fitting to have those conversations during that time. But there's also been conversations around institutional and academic contexts, community-centered research, participation, and engagement, and then also conversations about the impact that the pandemic has had on communities as well. So the roundtables have been held, inviting researchers, thought leaders, various individuals from professional organizations, community advocates to the table to be able to discuss these issues, but also to provide some informed solutions and ideas about how to address this lack of engagement and the concerns that we have about developing our workforce for the future. So that was one of the first steps to this phase. And the roundtables, the readouts, those have all been published and are publicly available for anyone who's interested on OSTP's website. But then the second phase to this work has been what has been launched as the Time is Now Advancing Equity in Science and Technology Ideation Challenge. And it's where we have asked all Americans to share their ideas and insights and recommendations to answer an essential question of, how can we guarantee all Americans can fully participate in and contribute to science and technology. And so that ideation challenge is on challenge.gov. It's open to absolutely everyone. And folks just need to go there. The barriers to participate are very, very low. So it's not an arduous form. There are not a ton of pieces of information that we're looking to collect, except for really the ideas that everyone has to address the challenges and the barriers. And nothing is too small or too too big. Just we're looking for everything that Americans have to contribute to the conversation. That challenge actually closes tomorrow. So we're definitely looking for anyone who is interested to take that time today or tomorrow and make sure to contribute to the challenge. And really, again, looking for these ideas that we can take action to, that we can use to transform the way that we are approaching equity and within STEM. The other thing that I'll just mention too is that, from the roundtables, from the Ideation Challenge, we are, again, looking towards these actions and developing an action plan that will be released in 2022. And really will, provide some fodder to the work that we're looking to do out of OSTP around this work. But then also, what was mentioned earlier, there's also the Committee on STEM Education, and that is, an area where we are still continuing to invest, time and energy in. At times, the work of CoSTEM may not always appear to be to the public eye, but there are, one of the key task for CoSTEM is really to support that collaboration and coordination within the federal government. And that is something that is definitely happening. And OSTP is helping to support that and foster that. There's the work within that helps to coordinate, computational literacy, computer science, and data science efforts across the agencies. There's also the work that helps to communicate how to prevent the silos of disciplines and really supporting transdisciplinary, convergent thinking and learning. There's also the work that is going on with some of the groups that support work-based learning, particularly around internships, fellowships, and such. And recently there has been a internship community of practice that has been formed. And that's where the federal agencies have been able to really, take the impact of the pandemic and identify ways to still engage, young learners in fellowship through internships or fellowships in particular. And so that was particularly something that was found to be helpful going into the pandemic and taking in-person programming and moving it to virtual experiences. There's also the work that CoSTEM has been doing to support, recent legislation. So, there is the work that we're doing to support veterans and military spouses in STEM careers. And that's something that has been active recently due to legislation and something we've taken on. And then also just to say too, within CoSTEM, there is a interagency working group on inclusion in STEM, where the focus is to support diversity, equity, inclusion across all of the agencies and particularly across FC STEM through its interagency working groups. But also, one of their charges is to support the development of the federal STEM workforce. And so recently what was published by FC STEM, CoSTEM, NSTC, and OSTP through that IWG was a report on the best practices for diversity and inclusion in STEM education and research. And so that is a publicly available product that has come out of the work of the agencies to be able to speak to the things that we are doing, the things that we're working towards, and also, it provides some best practices in there for others to consider in their work as well. I think I will, leave my comments there as far as some of the work that OSTP is doing. I'm just definitely touching upon some of the high points, some of the big points here. There's a lot of work that we are doing, in support of tech equity as it relates to, again, access and privacy. And, there's an AI Bill of Rights that we are advocating for at this moment. So there's a number of actions that we are taking on in support of overall STEM equity, and particular, the work that we'll be doing to support STEM education, workforce development, and our current and future STEM workforce as well. So I'll leave my comments there and look forward to continued conversation with folks today, but also welcome that always, because we are very eager as we're continuing our work around CoSTEM and developing a new strategic plan to engage folks in identifying these ideas and actions together.
Nafisa, thank you so much. We threw in the chat a link to the challenge.gov, and that'll be great homework for our members to get done here before tomorrow. And in there, thank you for sharing that opportunity, and we look forward to sharing feedback there. I'm going to turn it over to Patty briefly to explain some of her work going on at Department of Education. Patty, when you're ready.
Great, thanks. And Nafisa is a hard act to follow, but I'm really honored to be on the panel and with you all today. I've recognized some of the names and faces in the participant list, so it's good to see you. I've been serving as the STEM Fellow at the Department of Education. This is now my 3rd out of 4 years. And I thought today I would talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that support STEM funding, whether it's at the state or local level primarily. Next slide. So the department has a number of funding resources. Our budget's around $77 billion, and about 3/4 of that funding goes directly to state school districts and states and school districts. And then the other portion through formula programs. And then the other funding streams are what we call discretionary grants that the secretary can create through either national activities funds via various programs or through other congressionally authorized discretionary competitive grants. Of course, everyone has heard about all this slew of emergency funds that have been distributed per appropriations from Congress. We just, pushed out like billions and billions of dollars. So I'll talk a little bit more about those in the next few slides. Next, please. So the emergency funds came in sort of 3 or 4 buckets. One was the first round of what we call ESSER 1 funds. And these slides Thomas has, so he can distribute these. These are links to like FAQs or fact sheets to explain more fully what each of these provide for. And then there was the second round, what we're calling ESSER 2 funds that went to school districts. And then finally, the American Rescue Plan, which is sort of the big bucket of funds to support schools in sort of recovery and dealing with COVID, and whether it was physical or emotional supports for schools and children and students across the country. Next slide, please. 2 things I wanted to point out with respect to the recovery plan is that 20% was set aside for after school and summer learning. So any of you that are involved in those programs, which I presume a good deal of you are, working in sort of the out of school time space, these funds are required by states to support that informal after school, summer school, extended day learning. And so there's great opportunity to push on STEM as one of the functions or content areas for student learning and engagement using these dollars. And then the other point is that each of the states had to submit a plan, how they plan to spend their American Recovery Act funds. And we actually, the department provided a good deal of the funding up front, but to get the last bit of money, they had to submit a plan. And so we are approving and monitoring plans. And I encourage you to look at your state plan to see where and if there has been a focus on STEM education. And if not, again, there's a lot of flexibilities that the states and the local districts have. So I feel like there's a lot of money that has not yet been spent or claimed. So there's a lot of opportunity for state engagement to access those dollars to provide, whether it's teacher supports or student opportunities in STEM. Next slide. These are just a couple of the formula programs that I wanted to draw your attention to. that can support STEM, and one in particular acknowledges STEM. These are Title 4A, which is part of the statute. It's the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants. This is a fairly new program. It's a large bucket, I call it. It assembled a lot of smaller programs historically into one large grant that goes to the states and then directly to the school districts by formula. And there's 3 activities that these funds can be spent on. One is providing a safe and healthy school environment for students. The other is providing a well-rounded education, which is where STEM and computer science are specifically mentioned as authorized uses of funds. And then the last is improving the use of technology in classrooms. And this also can be accessed for STEM teacher professional development so that teachers are aware of using new technologies in classrooms. Then Title 4B is our 21st Century Community Learning Center program, which is the direct formula funding for after school and summer school and extended day learning. And these are, again, opportunities to engage with providers to provide STEM activities and learning. And then I mentioned a few other titles within the legislation that could be used for STEM funding. Title I really focuses on low-income schools, as do most of our funding streams. And then you can see some of the other opportunities there. And next slide, please. I'm trying to stay on my time limit here. So then we have discretionary grants, which again is more of a competitive opportunity for institutions, often of higher education, nonprofits, science museums, et cetera, that can apply for these funding opportunities. And the secretary often has a STEM priority, which they will layer onto these competitions and provide additional points. So if, say, the scale was 100 points, you could get 5 additional points if you offered STEM or computer science in your proposal. One is the teacher quality partnerships, which focuses primarily on pre-service teacher preparation. So I think you all are probably more in this space of maybe supporting effective educator development, which is more of a in-service teacher professional development. And then finally, a very popular one for STEM and computer science is the Education, Innovation, and Research grants, particularly the early phase. There's 3 phases: early, mid, and scale up. This was formerly known as the I3 or Innovation and, oh, I don't even remember the acronym, but it too is a favorite of Congress. They've been very generous in supporting this program and have actually identified that half of the funds should go to STEM and computer science programs, and then the other half are supporting SEL, at least in the current appropriation. Sorry, that's my alarm. So I just wanted to draw your attention to those grants. Now I'm turning this off. I'm so sorry here. Next slide, please. So I wanted to finally just draw your attention to the fact that there is a STEM newsletter that I produce monthly, talk not only about the Department of Education opportunities, but some of the other federal STEM agencies. So I encourage you to sign up for that. I try to do these monthly briefings, and the next 3, in fact, are going to be focusing on climate and environmental literacy. November 30th, we'll be partnering with the Department of Energy to talk about STEM opportunities and diversity in the energy workforce. Our Institute of Educational Sciences has a STEM research funding portfolio. The Office of Educational Technology has a list of funding opportunities for ed technology. And then finally, these 2 links talk about our funding forecasts. We're in sort of very beginning of a new fiscal year, but we're on a continuing resolution. So, expect all of our new grants come out in the spring typically. So you can see the forecast there and some other tools with respect to applying for grants. And I think that's the end of my slides. So I hope that was helpful. You know, STEM is a priority for the administration. It is a priority for the secretary. Of course, diversity and equity is, you know, very sort of the big umbrella now for all of our programs. And yeah, so I appreciate the opportunity to share with you and happy to answer any questions. I'm going to try to turn off this alarm now.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you for providing all the details on those resources. Also, I see behind you those lovely axes on the wall.
Oh, you see the guitars?
When you stepped away, that's all that came into focus.
Those are not my toys. Those are my husband's toys.
We've got a question here from Deb about the slides, and yes, happy to share these slides afterwards. There's great links and content in there. I'm going to ask a couple questions for both of you, and we'll do this the same way we had in the first panel, where if folks want to put their questions in the chat and start to get those queued up, I can then call on folks to you know, take those. We heard a little bit, Patty, both from you and Nafisa, about some of the priorities in the STEM education space, both the Department of Education and OSTP. What can we as a large network do to help advance those priorities? And you know, a large network, but also knowing that we're made up of individual state networks.
Yeah, I guess my push is to really encourage you to work with your local or your state school, your state Department of Education, because they're getting, you know, all of the CARES and rescue funds and for distribution to the school districts. And some of them, frankly, are struggling and trying to figure out what to do with those funds. So if you have like things off the shelf that are STEM ready, not shovel ready, but STEM ready for implementation, whether it's after school or teacher professional development programs, I think that they would be happy to hear from you.
Thanks, Patty. Nafisa, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you know, whether it be the, you know, ideation challenge that I mentioned before, but I think one thing that's really important is, you know, to ensure that we're connecting policy to practice, or, you know, research to practice. And so I think one thing that's really important is knowing, you know, what is working and what is not working, and how that needs to be adjusted to improve impact and effectiveness. So I think, you know, making sure that we're keeping those lines of communication open, and when there's an opportunity to share your thoughts or to share your insight, it's just incredibly valuable, because what may be working in one place or in one space, in particular your state, it may not be the case in another state. And so needing to know, you know, what is working for all, or what is not working for all, really helps us to determine what are those next steps that need to be made. So anytime something's being done at a federal level, you know, how does that then trickle down into states, and how does that, how is it working or not working, is just something we need to be cognizant of. And so, you know, when the invite is going to you to be able to share your insight, just please be ready to share it, because we really want to know.
Thank you. That's helpful, and I know that this group is always eager to to share when they can.
You know, Thomas, I'd like to add something, just because I was able to listen to the congressional panel. It was just so refreshing to hear those young women that were, you know, very engaged and committed to STEM education. So I would, you know, reiterate their call for sort of constituent advocacy, that they do listen, and that those local stories are really important for them to, you know, develop policy and promote policy. You know, the whole sort of congressional thing can be cumbersome, right? But we did have some infrastructure, signed in a bipartisan fashion. So it shows that we can get things done. And I just want to iterate that, you all play an important role both at your state and at the federal level in advocating for STEM priorities and policies.
Patty, thank you. And that actually leads into the second question that I wanted to share or to ask before turning to some that are coming into the chat, which is in that first panel. I think Kate had talked about, legislation that's in the works that would focus on looking at some of those NSF, maybe those pilots, maybe those one-offs, and finding ways to make them a bit more sustainable. What are your thoughts, Nafisa, Patty, on the best way to do that? Even if that legislation, that could be 2 years down the pike to getting passed. What are some ways that our network members can focus on maybe taking one of their programs that they got funding for as a one-off and really working to make it sustainable? Because that's a concern I think that we hear is, this funding, especially some of these emergency funds, are great, and no one's going to turn those down. No one's going to turn those dollars down. But how do you create sustainability out of one-time dollars?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think part of the thinking does need to be around and knowing when looking at funding, what is the kind of the tenor of the funding. So how often are projects funded, for how long? What is the expectation? Because I will say for NSF, and then I'm definitely speaking from my experience being there and prior to OSTP, but I think there is the opportunity for longer term funding, not just the one-time opportunity. But that being said, there is there are those expectations about how the project or how the work will move forward and perhaps evolve and change over time. So, whether it's starting with a capacity building grant and or, a full proposal, oftentimes there is that expectation if you are starting with funding to then move to a new place, which means, collaborating with others or, increasing the reach or the audience that the project has. And I think one of the ways that supports that sustainability is being able to, seeing for yourself how that program has the opportunity to grow and expand its reach. So I will just say, one of the things that I have seen in development, and it was said earlier today, but also I think is very much a part of the interest in the conversation, is how to support these efforts around scalability and dissemination. There's the work around implementation science. There's the work around the research of getting how we move from research to practice effectively. And so I think there's much work to be done to share what is working and to be able to sustain that and replicate that or adjust it as the audience and the space is needed. So that is one of the things that we are very supportive of, and that is making sure the things that are working well have an opportunity to work well with others, and making sure others know about where good things are occurring.
Thanks, Nafisa. Anything to add on that, Patty?
Yeah, I would echo Nafisa's comments that, I guess being on the outside for years as an advocate for STEM education, we saw, for instance, the math science partnerships. We saw NSF as sort of the research, going deep into what works. And then the Department of Education through their formula grants and trying to disseminate and implement those programs. So clearly, evidence-based decision-making, evidence-based programs are ones that are going to carry the day. And I think if you can start to embed those into some of the formula funding that's going out there, then you're going to create some sustainability. Of course, partnerships are important, right? Whether you can get industry to support or other philanthropic institutions, but that is never, a long-term scenario either. So I think getting sort of embedded into the normal sort of funding streams, whether it's in school or out of school or for teacher preparation programs, I think is really the key to long-term sustainability.
Thanks very much, Patty. I see one question here in the chat. And Regina, before I turn it over to you to ask that, because, Nafisa and Patty, you were both on and listening during our first panel, I'd be interested in your thoughts and sort of a response to the question that Lee Meadows asked about the impetus and sort of, do we need a new national STEM moment? And what that looks like from your guys' perspective. And then I'll turn it over to Regina.
Yeah, I think, I've been doing this advocacy for STEM for many, many years, and everyone talks about we need a new Sputnik moment. But, as Nafisa mentioned, OSTP and the agencies have a STEM strategic plan that we are still continuing to work on. I sit on a couple of the interagency working groups. Nafisa mentioned the inclusion in STEM. There's one on strategic partnerships that is looking at sort of STEM learning ecosystems. And we're creating sort of a definition, and we're hoping that across agencies, we start using common language in our RFPs and our contracts and our programs, so that we engage ecosystems. Because similarly, our dollar, we want, a good return on investment, and we want sustainability and continuity. So engaging ecosystems such as STEMx are important to that initiative. And then the other interagency working group is, I want to call it more cutting edge, that we're working on convergence in STEM education, which is a term that has come out of NSF and research, but we're looking at, how does that look like, or what does that look like in the classroom, and how do we allow teachers to provide sort of integrated multidisciplinary STEM experiences for their students. So stay tuned. We too will have something hopefully public on how we can support, again, across agencies, that type of learning and teaching.
Yeah, and I will just add, I don't know if there is the Sputnik moment at this time, but I think one thing that I hope I conveyed earlier, even with the name that we have for the Ideation Challenge, the time is now, I think speaks to the urgency that we at OSTP are seeing around advancing equity in STEM. And I think while advancing equity is not new per se, I think there is significant momentum, significant understanding and leadership right now about how important it is to engage all learners in STEM education workforce right now more than ever. And to, I want to say, our speaker earlier, to the point, more and more people are seeing how important STEM is in our competitiveness, right? In our ability to be globally competitive in the future. And so how we stress that priority within our schools, it's incredibly sad to hear that we had to choose between reading and STEM or reading and science. We all know that oftentimes science has not seen the same kind of time in schools as compared to math. And so and yet, I have to say I'm a biologist by training. And so, it's science for me that really sparked my interest in STEM and in my love for learning. And so we have to be concerned about where students and learners are losing the opportunity to be sparked and engaged and excited about STEM. And so when we're losing that within our schools, we are running a risk that we're losing that opportunity for them to engage in our STEM workforce for the future. Because, even if they, let's say, complete the test, are they motivated, engaged, and excited to do this work? And I think that's so important to, for that motivation and for that engagement and for that belonging, which really is part of it when we're addressing equity. So I think that is definitely part of the priority. I don't know how, poignant it is as far as Sputnik goes, but I definitely think it's one of the things that is foremost and forefront, at least for OSTP right now, as it relates to the work that we're doing.
Thank you so much. Regina, I saw your question in the chat first, and I'll turn that over to you. Reminder, folks, if you have any questions for our two great panelists, throw those in the chat while we still have some time here.
Thanks, Thomas. Mine's just a quick question, because I know that ESSER and Gear Money has been out there for a while. Is there a drop dead date on it? There are several groups on this call that I think would be open to partnering with LEAs, but I just don't know what the time limit is, because it's been a while since I've looked at it.
Great question, Regina. I want to say just approximately 3 years for the funds to be spent. And, but I will say also during COVID, we've had a lot of extensions and waivers for, current fiscal year funding and spending, because schools were closed. I mean, kids were not showing up to summer programs. So, I think there'll be a good bit of flexibility. Nobody wants to turn money back to the Treasury, frankly. So, there is a little bit of a window there, but we are concerned that it's kind of piling up, and we don't want folks to say, oh, well, you didn't need it, obviously, give it back.
I have a question. And this is for both panelists. Given the pandemic and the fact that it was really hard on schools all over the country, and there's learning recovery that needs to happen. And also I'm looking back at Patty's comment that Title IV Part A says provide students with access to a well-rounded education. I wonder, are we ever at risk of STEM getting lost in the mix? There are so many competing priorities. There are so many things that we need to fix. STEM doesn't mean the same thing to every audience. And so can you talk a little bit about the way STEM reads from an agency perspective, and does it still mean the same things that it did before? And how do we make sure that we're not leading people down the wrong path when we're talking about STEM, and we're talking also about engaging everyone? And maybe some people don't see themselves as a STEMist per se. That was a lot of questions packed into one, but hopefully you can talk about some of those pieces.
Yeah, I'll take off my ed hat and just give you some of my impressions, I guess, as being an advocate for STEM education for 30 some years. I think a lot is driven by, there's a very short phrase, we measure what we treasure, right? So the legislation requires states and districts to test for math and English or reading, language arts. It does require that states have science standards in place and that they do assess, but there's not a requirement that they show progress necessarily in science. So, as everyone here probably knows, it gets sort of the short end of the stick because that is not as a high priority with respect to the assessments. I think the development, and again, this is not Department of Ed talking because we don't endorse or curricula or standards, but the development of the next generation science standards, I thought was a really helpful in pushing on STEM because it was much more of an integrated approach. So, you know, I think it's important to make sure that the state assessments now sort of mirror the standards, that if they've adopted NGSS or a version of NGSS, and that will help drive instruction locally if the local state assessments mirror NGSS. Yeah, so I'll leave it there for now. That's my impression about, you know, where STEM is.
Thank you so much, Patty.
Heather, I think that's a really hard question, because I will say, you know, STEM and or let's just say STEM education, it is incredibly broad, and I say that because what we're aiming to do. Sometimes I have conversations, and when I'm mentioning STEM or STEM education, it's the belief that this is, you know, just about K-12 education, or it's only about, you know, science and math. There are, you know, kind of just beliefs that people have about what STEM is or what STEM education includes. And so part of the conversations that I have is kind of explaining, you know, the full breadth of the work, whether it's because, you know, when we're talking about what's being covered within, you know, elementary to high school, but then also, you know, what's happening in community colleges, what's happening in four-year schools, technical workforce, and that's all a part of the conversation. And likewise, again, when we're having conversations about what even, for example, the Committee on STEM Education does, again, there's sometimes the thought that it's limited to education. And that's definitely the baseline or the foundation, but it extends to the workforce, extends to the current workforce. And so I think it's very difficult to identify those strategies that can cover all these different places and spaces that this work is responsible for. But that being said, you can't do one, you can't focus on one thing without knowing how it influences everything else. And so I think that's part of the work that we have, is to look at to look at this in its entirety, in its continuum, and being able to identify the various places that we can interject you know, opportunity for improvement that will have a cascading effect on other areas. So I think, you know, I just, when you're mentioning this question and also being mindful of, you know, Patty's response, I think there's a lot that needs to be done, thinking broadly, because some of the work that does need to be done specific to supporting science in our schools or math in our schools, but it's very complex and it's very, you know, interdisciplinary, it's very transdisciplinary. And so it also needs that effort, that conceptualization to make sure we're having conversations and understanding what we're talking about when we're talking about STEM, and understanding the full breadth and scope of this work.
Thank you so much. It's a tough question, and thank you.
I think they both gave excellent answers, and I am really happy that we had, you know, good participation, good questions for our two panelists. One of our STEMx members, so I don't know if they're on the call today, but they like to say that STEM is strategies that engage minds. Our partner, Sam Houston from North Carolina, and I think that you know, that sums it up very well. I think we have about 6 minutes until 4 o'clock. And with that, we are going to take a quick 6-minute break before starting our third and final session of the afternoon. I want to thank both Patty and Nafisa again for their time and for sharing everything that they did with us. We'll be sure to distribute the slides that Patty had with folks. And don't forget to go to the link challenge.gov that's up there that Nafisa shared and provide your feedback through tomorrow. But with that, we'll see you in 5 minutes at 4 o'clock.
Thanks again, Thomas. Keep up the good work, everyone.
Part 3, I successfully remembered to put the recording back on, so we're already ahead of the game. That's fantastic. Thanks again to our previous panels. This was a great discussion, and we're really happy to have so many good questions and hear such great information and resources. For our third segment, we're going to move towards more of a state perspective. And we have invited Klaus von Zastro, Director of Principals from Education Commission of the States, to join us. He's going to give us a sort of 25,000-foot view of what's happening across our country. And then we're going to zoom in on a couple of different states to hear what they're doing. During that part, we certainly, if you have some other comments from your particular state about the ways in which you're using federal dollars or grants that you've received, we'd love to hear from all of you. And certainly we'll have a discussion and ask questions. But we'll turn it back to Klaus for a second. Klaus is the Director of Principals from Education Commission of the States. And as the Director of Principals, Klaus works with the Principals team to provide leadership on state education policy and research. He has been around for a long time. He has held senior positions in education organizations for 20 years and has spent much of that time helping diverse stakeholders find consensus on important education issues. Klaus is dedicated to ensuring that state leaders have the information and guidance they need to make the best possible decisions affecting young people. So we would love to hear your guidance so that we can make great decisions affecting young people. And with that, we will let you get started.
Great. And so my very first order of business is to share the right screen. And I think I'm not sharing the right screen, right? That's not the actual.
No, you've got it.
It's a proper presentation, not anything worse.
It's not the rest of your screen, it's just your slide.
Just the slide. Oh,
it looks gorgeous.
Okay, thank you. So I'm working with 3 different monitors here, and so I'm seeing 3 different entirely different things, and it's hard to tell what's what. So glad to see that that's worked. And I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you, Heather, and that I'm really delighted to be here. I'm also especially delighted to be back at STEMx because I know some of you from the days when STEMx was founded, and it's wonderful to see the legacy that Margaret Ishida helped to build and to see just how much really important work has been going on and how it's grown. And, so I couldn't be more pleased to be able to speak to this group and to have heard a lot of the very interesting conversation that's already happened. So as Heather said, I'm Klaus von Zastro from Education Commission of the States, for those of you where we have not met. And we're a national education policy organization that's been serving state policymakers in all 50 states and the District of Columbia for nearly 60 years. So we are nonpartisan, and we cover education issues from early learning through post-secondary and the workforce. Now, the way we work is that we believe in the power of learning from experience. And that means that we use what we know about state trends and approaches from across the country to help state policymakers make informed decisions about what might work in their state. And we do this in a variety of ways, right? So we publish research, we publish reports, we host convenings, and we also provide counsel tailored to the needs of individual states. So what I'll talk about today, as Heather mentioned, is I'm going to talk about the status of STEM, both during and before the pandemic. We'll also look at the impact the pandemic has had on post-secondary enrollments. And I have to say, this is not especially cheerful news. There are some bright spots in this, but there's a lot of really challenging stuff that's been happening that I know a number of people have already made reference to at this meeting. But at the end, we'll kind of try to look at the status of state STEM policies during the pandemic. Is there going to be another Sputnik moment, or is the STEM policy happening in a different way at the state level? And finally, I wanted to consider some lessons the pandemic has actually left behind. Consider the importance of doing more than just sort of getting back to where we were and repairing the damage of that last crisis, but really talking about moving ahead. So let's talk about this changing landscape in K-12 STEM. Even before the pandemic, we did see cause for pessimism and for some optimism, right? So scores in math and science had plateaued or declined, but areas like computer science have really seen big gains in access, thanks in large measure to state policy. So I'm going to present some data here. But I want to make clear that, some of this is going to be a test and assessment data. I don't want to suggest that that's the end all and be all of quality and progress in STEM, but I do think it is an indicator that we should pay attention to because it's shown a trajectory in some ways that we don't necessarily want to see. And so I'll start with the bad news. And as many of you know, math and science scores in particular have leveled off or declined almost everywhere. And so I'll start with some very recent data that was recently published. And this is pre-pandemic data. We saw nationally that the long-term trend data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress that stretches all the way back to the 1970s was pretty telling. So, for the first 35 years, we saw substantial gains. And so for those people who said we've worked and we haven't seen progress, I think this is a pretty strong refutation of that. For decades, there was progress, and there was progress across racial and ethnic groups of students. That's important to remember because, our actions can make a difference even in this indicator. But then between 2012 and 2020, there were declines, and that was especially among students of color. And so note, by the way, that these data use federal classifications of race and ethnicity that date to the 1970s, because that's when the assessment started, and that's how they created trends. Even so, this is telling us that there has been some slipping backwards, at least on this indicator. And we've seen that on other indicators too, including state assessments of some sort, but also certainly the National Assessment of Education Progress in mathematics in the more recent iterations of that assessment. So we see it as well in the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Science, which just came out this year. And so I'm showing you data for fourth grade. Science has actually been a bright spot where we've seen significant improvement in fourth grade between 2009 and 2015, but that too was followed by a decline. And even though this doesn't look very steep on the screen, this is actually statistically significant. It's meaningful that those gains that were made in prior years were pretty much given up in the last assessment. And there have also been indications that the average time that fourth graders spend on science has actually decreased between 2015 and 2019. So we see declining scores, but we also see evidence that there's less of a focus in elementary science. And in eighth grade science, scores were mostly flat, right? So not a whole lot of progress there, unfortunately. But as I mentioned before, there were some bright spots, and this is especially in computer science. And this is an area where we can look to state policy as the mechanism that's really made measurable change and in a relatively short amount of time. And of course, that's thanks also in part to tireless efforts of advocates, including more than a few who are on this call and who have been very active in the STEMx states and STEMx network. So I'm going to start with data that many of you may have seen from the very recent code.org report. And that shows that roughly half of US schools offered AP computer science in 2020 to 2021. Now, of course, that doesn't sound great, right? Because like half of them don't, right? So that's not in itself a wonderful piece of data. However, one has to think that, just back in 2017, 2018, it was only 35% of high schools. So this is actually fairly rapid growth. Now, of course, there's a lot of other work that's going on to train teachers and to make sure that this access is really of high quality. That is ongoing work, and that's going to take a while. But I think we should mark this as progress. Now, there are still substantial differences in access by family income, by school location, with rural schools, especially trailing behind, for example, and by race ethnicity, with Black students enjoying the least access. So these are still substantial problems. And we've also seen inequities by gender. Only 31% of high school computer science courses were taken by female students. But here too, there may be cause for hope. Nationally, female students made up about 49%, so roughly half of enrollments in elementary computer science classes. So this might be evidence that there is a group of students moving through the system who in a few years, girls going into high school may be more apt to take computer science. And we might see these percentages improving. So all I can say here is stay tuned. But now the pandemic has really taken a toll. And most of the data I've just shown you dates to before the pandemic. Now that the computer science data is a little more recent, but we can see that even before the pandemic, there were some signs of trouble. We've started measuring, by we, I mean the world of research, and I can't take credit for it, has started measuring the pandemic's impact in certain areas in STEM, and it is actually troubling. So first, there was an impact on how much math students learned. So students didn't actually lose learning. So I want to say that I always avoid the term learning loss, but students did make far fewer gains over the course of 2021 than they had in the 2018-2019 year, for example, the last complete year before the pandemic. And the Northwest Evaluation Association's MAP assessment and math provides some useful national data. And so that's what you're seeing on the screen here with these dotted lines. And what you're seeing is average growth in grades 3, 5, and 7 in the 2018-2019 school year. Now that's a good baseline for expectations of what growth should have been in a non-pandemic year. So now look at what happened in the 2020-2021 year. There was substantially less student growth, and the effects were felt most strongly by students of color and students in low-income households for whom, as the research has told us, the pandemic's effects were most disruptive and devastating. Now, the effects have been a bit harder to trace in K-12 science, but there were some early data suggesting that science was getting short shrift in the pandemic. A survey of California middle school teachers found that 88% said students spent less time on science during the pandemic. And even though this is California data, I suspect it's pretty representative of what's been happening in other states as well. And it was certainly representative of what I saw in my own house in the District of Columbia as my daughter did remote schooling. She did have less science. That same survey showed that most middle school teachers, in this case 60%, reported that it was harder to engage students in science or engineering practices, which, as many of you know, was a core ingredient of new science standards embraced in many states. And so this does suggest, though it's only a snapshot from California, it suggests that students really have had a really substantial gap in their science education as a result of the pandemic, as resources and facilities and materials and all kinds of things became unavailable. Now, what's happened in post-secondary? We do have information on the pandemic's impact on post-secondary credentials, and it's been an earthquake. STEM disciplines were hit generally less hard than others, which I think attests to their staying power, but STEM was hit too. So I'm going now to data from the National Student Clearinghouse that's really quite recent, and this is data on declines in bachelor degree enrollments for the 5 most popular bachelor's degree areas. And the STEM areas you see here are in orange. Now, so this shows declines in STEM bachelor's degree enrollments between 2019, before the pandemic, and 2021. Now, health professions and biology take the smallest hit. Engineering plunges a bit farther. Liberal arts and scientists, of course, takes the biggest hit, as you see in this particular chart. But then when we move to questions of associate degrees, the picture looks substantially grimmer. And this chart is of the top 5 associate's degrees, including STEM degrees, which are again in orange. So now as I change the view for you, note that most fields experience deeper declines for associate degrees than for bachelor's degrees. Now, even computer and information science associate's degrees declined roughly as far as engineering bachelor's degrees had. So these are substantial and real declines in a very short space. And when you compare that with the trend before, which had been growing and growing and increasing across the board, this is, of course, cause for concern. However, once again, you look at those orange bars, it's the STEM degrees, once again, that have proven most resilient. So now that we've looked at all of these data, let's step back for a minute and start asking ourselves what's happening to STEM policy. So we've seen troubling and encouraging data, but in STEM education policymaking, there has been substantial policymaking, but state leaders are also dealing with lots of competing priorities right now. And so that's the kind of balance that we have to see as we ask ourselves, is there a Sputnik moment? I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. And I would say yes and no. And so you'll forgive me the weasel words, but you'll understand why. So first of all, we did see a ton of state STEM policymaking around STEM education between about, I'd say 2010 and 2017 or 2018. So first, states adopted new standards in math, as you all know so well. They adopted new standards in science with next generation science standards or adaptations of that standards being embraced in states across the country. They altered graduation requirements, sometimes to leave room for career and technical education or computer science. They also expanded access to computer science in K-12 through things like required course offerings, standards, teacher training, and other kinds of measures. And they also adopted career and technical education policies that aim to create clearer pathways to jobs that are in demand. So that's really a lot of policy making in what's a relatively short amount of time. But already before the pandemic, the pace of STEM policy making had slowed. And so, in part, this is understandable, because states had enacted so many policies, and then attention has to shift to implementation. And implementation is sometimes harder to track, certainly from a state perspective and with state lens, since a lot of that is local. But let's look at some measures of what might be considered a change in STEM interest. Now, this isn't a perfect measure, but it's interesting to see what the trends were in governors' state of the state addresses over the past 10 years. So if you look at this, you see that mentions of STEM hit a peak in 2018 with a lot of governors who then were celebrating computer science initiatives, but then they dropped off in subsequent years. If we look at career and technical education, which is certainly adjacent to STEM, that sort of built after 2015, but has also seen some drop off after 2019, which is possibly due in part to the pandemic. So, as I noted before, states can't legislate on a topic forever, right? The challenge shifts to making the most of legislation that states have already put on the books. Now, there's another imperfect but still interesting measure. I'm showing you a graph of trends in Google searches for the term STEM education over the past 17 years. So you see now the first 10 years in that, and there was a lot of growth over that first decade, from 2004 to 2014, as leaders began speaking about STEM education and the public began searching for information about it. But then after 2014, searches began to fall off again, dropping about 60% from their peak at the end of 2021. So now, again, not a perfect measure, but the change does suggest that public interest might be shifting to other things, even if it also might suggest that more people now know what STEM education is and don't need to Google it anymore. Having said that, though, it's fair to say that there are lots of policy priorities right now and lots of public priorities. And so STEM might have to spend a little more time gaining attention now than it had done, say, 5 or 6 years ago. So now, after I give that windup, I do think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of substantial STEM policy making, even now, and STEM policies that have taken root during the pandemic. And so the frame around a lot of this is the need to prepare our workforce, which has been a real rallying cry. So I don't know if we call the pandemic a Sputnik moment, but it certainly is a moment where workforce and the dreadful impact that it had on so many working people, especially early on, has put a frame around the need to have many more people prepared to succeed in a changing economy. So first, let's look at states' computer science commitments in K-12, and it looks like they really weathered the pandemic better than many suspected they would. So there's been some reallocation, or there had been some reallocation of funds away from computer science during the pandemic. But it's fair to say that computer science really seems to have bounced back. Code.org's report found that states had allocated $65 million in 2022, which was the highest total amount yet. So let's look at at least one state example. We have California, which made a big recent investment in computer science. California allocated $20 million for teacher training. As we all know, that's one of the biggest challenges as we make computer science more and more present in schools across the country, finding the teacher workforce who can teach those courses. Now, quite a few states also enacted policies to address interrupted instruction, which, as we saw, had a very serious impact in math. And many were able to use their share of federal recovery funds to do so. So I'm going to look at a few states that did this. 3 states that aim to do this already are Arkansas, Colorado, and Tennessee. They're by no means the only ones, but I think they're good examples. In the case of these 3 states, they've enacted legislation to promote tutoring that can help students accelerate in math and literacy. Now, Tennessee in particular included provisions to promote after-school learning mini camps to remediate students using science, technology, engineering, the arts, and math. And so I would note the STEAM focus here that was made in state policy. And Arkansas also focuses on tutoring for early learning and training for tutors. So I know that you'll hear more about Arkansas very soon. Let's look at some states now that have actually enacted policies to support career and technical education during the pandemic. And of these, there are quite a few, and I'm just going to offer you some examples here. Now, very notable is Florida. The legislature in 2021 passed expansive legislation to align K-12 school systems, community colleges, universities, and workforce agencies. And so this legislation improves coordination and alignment in Florida's workforce development system to strengthen career navigation and advising support for young people. And it also includes for adult learners and job seekers. And so what this does is it sort of improves access to the information on workforce needs and opportunities that people need to build much clearer pictures of the kinds of pathways they have to rewarding careers. Let's have a look at another state, and that would be Pennsylvania, which has made some very substantial investments in the career and technical education space. And Pennsylvania's vehicle for this is something called the PA Smart Initiative. And they put really substantial funds to the tune of $12.5 million into career and technical education and apprenticeships in high demand fields. Now, of course, this was an especially important area of focus during the pandemic. And a third state I wanted to look at is Colorado. Colorado has added options for youth apprenticeship programs, and they've taken an approach where they look at those intermediary organizations that support youth apprenticeships. So in 2020, the state passed legislation supporting CareerWise Colorado, as it's called. And it's a statewide intermediary that supports a youth apprenticeship program where participants split time between high school and the workplace. And so apprentices, they'll earn money, they earn a nationally recognized certification, and they also earn college credit. And by the way, I've seen questions about access to these slides, and I'd be most happy to share them so you can see the notes field where a lot of this information appears. Some states have also offered local education agencies guidance on how to spend federal recovery funds. And we heard a lot of this from Patty not long ago, but I wanted to focus on one state that I know is especially popular in this crowd, and that is Ohio, which offers a very good example here. Now, as you know, the American Rescue Plan specifies that at least 90% of funds should pass through to local school districts. And states can offer guidance, of course, here. And this is really what Ohio has done. The Ohio State Department of Education points to its guidance to local education agencies that can look to things like STEM summer learning, STEM after-school programs, high-quality STEM professional development, STEM-focused curriculum supports, or STEM as a school-wide approach. And so we'd heard earlier that in a way, not every agency knows what to do with all this money, right? That's the guidance that states can provide can be very, very helpful to help local education agencies understand how these rescue plan funds can be most effective to support STEM. So I wanted to think a little bit now to step back and think about the lessons that the pandemic might have sparked. Even though the pandemic has really had a devastating impact, it has also, I think, taught states lessons that can prompt thinking in some new directions. So for one, it created many new broadband initiatives across the country. So we learned a lot about getting children online quickly, for example, and we're far from done on that score, but I think states have advanced a great deal in that area. But the pandemic also introduced states to practices they might not have explored without it. So in Pennsylvania, for example, leaders realized that they could better deliver more professional development through a hybrid model, some in person and some remote, that would do a better job of meeting teachers' needs than the standard only face-to-face model. We also saw in the same state that leaders forged partnerships with nonprofits, with community organizations, media organizations, and then all of this to get more content to students as quickly as possible, and also to bring learning into communities when communities couldn't come to facilities. Now, those are things that can be carried forward. That isn't stuff that has to end at the pandemic. These partnerships have a lot of meaning. So, while on balance, the pandemic did grievous harm, but there's state and other leaders who can look at the strategies that they implemented in time of crisis and sort of consider extending that to the future. And I wanted to now end on something that Heather and I talked about a little bit when we last spoke, and that is this question about how state policy can also really create the kinds of reforms and shifts to STEM teaching and learning that a lot of STEM reformers look at. Things like creating more interdisciplinary instruction, place-based education, experiential or hands-on learning. I can't even sum it all up, but there's a lot of really substantial kinds of reform for which things like state policy feel like a pretty blunt instrument. So what role can state policy play, right? Can state policies require these reforms? I think that I imagine many of you would be skeptical of that. The trend towards local control can make state requirements a challenge. And, maybe you should be careful what you wish for if a state says, thou shalt teach thus and thus, right? That is not necessarily the way in which state policy can be most effective. I think it's more likely that states create structures and incentives for this less tangible sort of kind of changes. I shouldn't say they're less tangible because they're quite tangible, but I would say less formalized type of policy change that we're talking about. So, I'll give you some examples. So next generation science standards, which many of you know, focused on cross-cutting concepts. So in some states, it may have toppled some barriers to more interdisciplinary instruction, teaching, and learning. There are also questions of career and technical education policies and pathways that require work-based learning and create more opportunities for apprenticeships and these sort of more experiential learning opportunities. And we can point to Delaware with its Pathways program, which requires work-based learning as a part of career and technical education. So it's actually required. Well, Patty mentioned after school and out of school. There are states that are using American Rescue Plan funds to begin looking at this informal instruction space. So to work with local parks, for example, this is what Washington State is doing, working with local parks and rec departments to create summer youth development programs. Oklahoma plans to work with boys and girls clubs and YMCAs to improve after-school programs. And there are also just ways of supporting local efforts. Now, Pennsylvania, I mentioned their PA Smart initiative. Pennsylvania actually funds its STEM ecosystems through PA Smart. So they're actually funding their local STEM infrastructure without necessarily dictating what it is that local STEM infrastructure must do. So that's another way in which you create capacity, you create conditions without creating prescriptions. So I see that I'm at time, so I will stop there, and I really look forward to the conversation that happens. And I'm guessing I should stop sharing my screen. Is that right? Well, I will, so that way we can see each other.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, we wound up exactly where we're supposed to be. Klaus, thank you so much for that tour of the US and overview of trends and things that have occurred recently and where we are now. What I'd like to do is go into some more depth about a couple of different state initiatives. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Stacy Smith, who's the Deputy Commissioner and Director of the Office of Coordinated Support and Services from the Department of Education in Arkansas. And I'd like to welcome you to just tell us about what's happening in Arkansas and what you're working on these days.
Well, can you hear me and can you see me, I guess? I'm just going to double check in there. Okay. Well, first off, thank you for having me be a part of your meeting today. It's been interesting listening to the conversation and learning the different perspectives, especially around STEM education. But in Arkansas, we're really proud of the work and the partnership that we've had with Learning Blade over the past 6 years. That was part of Governor Hutchison's K-12 computer science initiative when he took office. We've been very successful with that. And continuing on with that partnership and using some of our federal funds to continue that, working towards industry certification. That is something that we're leaning heavily into as we move forward. Earlier, Heather, you asked the question about the relevance of science losing, its place with so many topics. And you're right now with everything from mental health and civics education to literacy topics, where does STEM fit in? Because there's so many big topics right now. And I think the partnership, listening to Dr. Klaus and him talking about the adjacents with industry, I mean, that's the piece there for STEM that's not going away. And we have to make sure to make STEM education relevant, that we are directly connecting it to our STEM fields. And so we do believe that this is one way in which we can do that. In Arkansas, we have had over 51,000 students actually complete a Learning Blade online lesson, totaling almost 200,000 hours just in that in the state. We've got we have Arkansas teachers who have downloaded over 10,000 resources from that one source. And have promoted different events. But just some other things I want to mention as far as Arkansas and the use of our ESSER or ARP funds, where we're trying to promote STEM education. And one of the areas that we really think is important right now is capacity building for our teachers. And so we have actually leveraged and used some of our funding to pay for teachers to go back to college and get certification in certain areas. 3 of those academies, we were calling them our teacher academies. One of those was actually a computer science academy where teachers could get 18 hours and walk away with a certification in computer science. Another was online teaching academies where they were actually doing online teaching performance assessments, trying to improve instruction in an online platform. And a third area was special education. And what we did there is we actually invited math teachers, general ed math teachers, general ed science teachers, and ELA teachers to actually participate in adding a special education endorsement onto their license. And we paid for that. We have them in cohorts. So we actually put all of our science and math teachers together, and they're going through talking about what are hands-on learning and accommodations that we can actually provide for our kids with this subject matter, and making it more meaningful and trying to promote that inclusiveness piece. So capacity building for our teachers, we felt like was something that we wanted to use our funding for. Some other things that we've done around STEM is kind of building that regional network through professional learning communities. We've done that statewide, and we actually have science teams with grade level topics where you can come into this network online and actually collaborate with other science teachers or math teachers throughout the state. So we felt like that, again, that capacity building and support for our teachers in the classroom was imperative. Another area that the ARP funds led that districts could use their funding for was around high quality instructional materials. And that has been lacking in classrooms for, goodness gracious, the last 2 decades. I mean, we've made it where folks no longer were using their science kits or high quality instructional materials in mathematics, and everybody was kind of making their own stuff. And you lost this. And let me tell you, if you think about STEM and the complexity of trying to put all those pieces together and you want it to be authentic, our teachers need support. And so really identifying what is high quality and making sure that that is what's getting in the hands of our teachers with the professional development that's needed for it is another area in curriculum that in Arkansas we are pushing towards. So while school districts right now have an unprecedented opportunity to purchase new curriculum that before wouldn't have been allowed to with federal funds, they really can look at what is high quality and how can we put that professional development with it. I know I'm going, if you need to cut me off, cut me off. Okay. Another thing that just with the curriculum aspect and in just this current field that we're in right now is the different online curriculums and support. So Arkansas did use our set aside funding to provide digital content in the area of STEM for all of our schools in Arkansas. We did that through different providers, and we also set aside funding to create our own digital content that really is looking at leading to more advanced manufacturing credentials. And again, that partnership piece. Dr. Klaus mentioned Arkansas tutoring. We did pass legislation, and we are actually working with higher ed institutions across the state and looking for candidates who are part of the teaching program right now to become tutors. And we are actually paying them stipends to go through additional training on how to work with students in the area of science, mathematics, and literacy. And so they're actually getting paid to get the training, and then they go and work with students. They come back and go through another training, get a stipend, go back and work with students. And so we're trying to create this tutoring workforce that will actually lead into becoming classroom teachers. We also partnered, if you don't know about schoolhouse.world, that was something that came from Sal Khan, kind of a Khan Academy tutoring piece. You actually had volunteers who were everywhere from mathematicians to attorneys to lawyers to all these different people who were tutoring specifically for math. And this was pre-algebra all the way through college coursework. And they were free tutors on any subject. And so if you're not familiar with that, you'll want to look at that. That is a free resource. We promoted that through our state and actually had our Kansans sign up to be tutors on that program. And schoolhouse.world actually monitors the quality. And we saw some really good things come from that. And then the last thing I want to share real quick is we set aside $25 million of our American Rescue Plan funds at the state level and partnered with a group called Out of School Network that works with Arkansas State University. And that is a separate kind of a third-party organization that is helping us give grants to different folks in the state on either STEM topics or ELA topics during after school, before school, or extended year. And just 3 of the ones that I know were funded that had a STEM topic was our Arkansas STEM Coalition had a project they had in there. Arkansas School for Math and Science was funded. Arts and Science Center in Southeast Arkansas. We had over 50 different grants that we've already put out all throughout the state. And I'm more than half of them have some type of STEM lens to it. And so that's another thing that we're excited about. And that's really that kind of that support piece. All right, that was fast and that was a lot. So I hope I covered what you needed me to.
Stacy, you covered that and then some. Thank you so much. We had a quick question. Can you share the name of the organization again regarding mentoring students?
Yeah, so we had Arkansas Tutoring Corps. It was what our legislation was called. And so we're actually organizing that ourselves. So we passed legislation, we wrote rules that had to be passed. And then we partnered with our educational renewal zones, which are, again, higher ed partners that are throughout the state. And they're helping us go into the different colleges and identify who those participants would be.
That's fantastic. I heard of a university in Ohio who recently won an EHR grant to train their paraprofessionals to be able to become classroom teachers. And so it's nice to see that pipeline. Yeah,
we're actually doing something very similar with a teacher residency program. Also partnering with school districts. I mean, there's a shortage nationwide in teachers. And so this concept of being able to grow your own and identifying is really important. And I'm going to tell you, I think education is a doorway for advanced careers for folks. And it's for people in our state where college graduation rates are very low here. It's a great field for people to get their foot into. So it's something we want to promote.
Absolutely. Thank you again for your time and for your comments. We're going to shift over to Ohio. I'd like to introduce Dr. Teresa Dempsey. She is relatively new at the Ohio Department of Education. She is the Assistant Director for Personalized Learning. I've had the pleasure of getting to work with her and getting to know her a little bit better over the last 3 months when I was finishing up my role as the Director of the Ohio STEM Learning Network. But Ohio has definitely spoken out and prioritized some STEM learning in our ESSER plan. So I'll turn it over to you, Teresa, to talk about that.
Hey, thanks, Heather. First, I just want to acknowledge that Ohio would not be where we are in STEM education if it weren't for you and the Ohio STEM Learning Network. And the support that I've received from you and Kelly Guerra Evans has just been a godsend. So thank you so much. And then again, for inviting me today to learn so much already. And so impressive to hear what Arkansas had to share in terms of what they're doing in the state. Our ESSER proposal is really showing a commitment to personalized learning and STEM education. We plan to continue to prioritize and expand personalized learning for our students. And this includes obviously STEM and STEAM education. We're working on creating some high school graduation options and the earning of industry recognized credentials. And, you know, we've started this work, we're new at it. We've added new staff like me. There was not an assistant director for personalized learning at the department up until 3 months ago. And we're also adding 2 new STEM positions that I'm super excited to have hopefully soon to build this team out. We're also in Ohio working on creating a PK20 strategic STEM plan, which is really exciting as we're looking at beyond 12th grade, right? It's the partnerships with higher ed that we really want to be aware of and build. And, you know, we've been working with a group called Chiefs for Change. They've been helping us facilitate that. And it's probably going to take a good 1.5 years to get that plan built out. And I know that Tele is also going to be helping us with facilitating that work. We've really focused on bolstering our relationship with the Ohio STEM Learning Network, and we're actually collaborating with them on a STEM redesignation process. So in Ohio, when our schools attain their STEM designation, you know, they get it for forever, or that's the way it's been. But now with new legislation, STEM designated schools after 5 years of attaining that designation are going to have to reapply to maintain that STEM designation. So that's something that we're working on as a proactive and positive relationship with our currently STEM designated schools and not as a punitive process. We just want to make sure that our STEM designated schools are maintaining the integrity of our STEM quality model. Another thing that we're working on is we're working with partners across the state to help them understand how to implement pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs in local districts. We believe that we've not done all there is to do in STEM education. There's a lot more, and we're really blessed to have these funds to continue to advance STEM education in our state. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Just another word about the apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship work. That was also funded from early ARP funds, and they had a program called Remote edX. And so I've had an opportunity to work on that and learn alongside schools as they navigate what does it take to have a pre-apprenticeship program? What does it take to have a registered apprenticeship? We have a little cohort of schools who are working on creating apprenticeship programs and sponsoring apprenticeship programs to backfill their bus drivers, their food service workers, their classified employees. And so thinking about back to Stacy's comments a few moments ago, that whole grow your own mentality, not just from the teaching workforce, but from other facets of the employees that it takes to run a school district. So that's been interesting, and it's really great to see the alignment and opportunities in the new Ohio graduation requirements to recognize industry credentials as being an important part of the learning process and something that's worth going after, that college is not the only pathway for every student, but rather creating a multitude of options that do result in, you know, gainful employment at the end of that journey. Excellent. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to any of our other states who have any good examples. You've heard great examples, and I'm sure that there's lots of other things to celebrate, to brag about, to share about. And so I would urge any of you who have something to share to let us know, and we'll open up the floor for a minute with just any sort of innovative programs, practices that have come along as a result of new funding that's been made available of late.
Well, Heather, this isn't new, but Jim put something in the chat about a Minnesota-based Math Corps program using AmeriCorps fellows. And I know a lot of us have AmeriCorps fellows. So Jim, if I could put you on the spot and ask you to give us more information about that, it'd be great. I think people would find it useful.
Thank you for the opportunity. Serve Minnesota, which is the AmeriCorps umbrella organization here in Minnesota, runs two programs preparing anyone to be a tutor in the schools. They run Reading Corps, which obviously works with younger students who are behind in reading, and Math Corps, which works with slightly older students. I think that one, if I recall correctly, doesn't begin until 4th grade, while the Reading Corps starts earlier. They utilize the AmeriCorps structure, so these individuals are first trained to a very rigorous model and monitored for fidelity in the implementation of that model in the school. They are paid by AmeriCorps and receive the educational benefits. It's an evidence-based program. The research on it is very good on the value of the interventions for the young people, the students involved. It also provides an opportunity for someone who is considering going into teaching, real classroom and school-based experience, as well as student-based experience, allowing them to kind of test drive and grow your own, to the language we're using here today, whether they want to go on into education. It's actually recruited not just young people who maybe are taking a gap year or are taking a pause from their higher education, but also folks like retirees who want to give back to their community, and then they are able to take the AmeriCorps educational benefit and pass it along to, in the cases I've talked to, their grandchildren. So Serve Minnesota is the host organization, Math Corps and Reading Corps. I'd highly recommend it. The state of Minnesota just put another $500,000 a year into the Math Corps program, specifically to bolster it, to Klaus's point earlier, to help students with their math, particularly coming out of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Jim. Is there anyone else who has a story or a program to share or a resource?
You know, someone that always has really great ideas and is very quiet, and he's probably going to get really mad at me, is Chuck English. Chuck's always got stuff cutting edge in the back of his head, and you just have to pull it out. So Chuck, I know you have something to say.
Thank you. My problem with the question is using the current funding. We're still trying to figure that out. And honestly, with a lot of changes that are going on right now, and Virginia has just elected a new governor, is changing out probably our superintendent and our secretary of education. It's trying to figure out how do we address everybody's interests and needs. And we also have a lot of independent school districts within the state. So it's trying to make sure that we kind of move things forward. The good news is, though, is that we do have a STEM advisory board to the governor's office. I do have opportunities to talk to all these people in the General Assembly, and we're moving everything forward. In fact, I just left a meeting earlier today to talk to the School Boards Association and got their support on trying to move forward. So we've got a lot of people that are wanting to talk about it. We are really working hard to dovetail our computer science and STEM together to make sure that it's a collaborative initiative, so we're not competing against each other for time, money, resources, and especially the attention of educators. So how do we make sure that we actually do a good job of integrating STEM so that way all children get to experience STEM and it's not elective? That way they all see themselves as capable and competent in moving forward, and they can see the opportunities and pathways rather than just some kids self-selecting to go into those areas. So I can get into more details, but I'm not using the current funding, which is why I was trying to be quiet. I was trying to hear, okay, how is everyone else using this? So I can possibly use this on my own.
You know, it's interesting. Thank you so much, Chuck. Yes, thank you for sharing. It looks like you're setting up a situation in Virginia where you're not going to have places choose. Is it reading or STEM? If it's all integrated, everyone will get what they need, which is wonderful. What I'm hearing from the field is people submitted their plans. The plans came back. They said, yes, we're approved, but then there's some additional sort of negotiation that needs to go on about how the money is actually going to be spent. this is the plan, but where are the allocations? And so we might be a little bit ahead of the curve. So I was thinking a little bit like, whoa, what if in a couple of months we have another conversation that's similar to this to find out what folks wound up doing once all the ink was dry?
I hope to report in the future that we have done great things with the money then at that point. I'm just not there yet.
Word. We hope that for you as well. Well, this has been an action-packed discussion. There's been lots of things to consider. I think we've met some new people. I'm really happy about that. Thanks to all of you who are new to attending STEMx events. Thanks to all of you who are not so new and came back to this event. And thank you all for coming and spending time with us. Please, please stay connected so that we can continue to share and learn from one another. I hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.